My family has a rule: never answer the phone after midnight. Then my sister broke it. Growing up, this wasn't some quirky family tradition or superstition that got passed around at reunions. This was the rule that got carved into us from the moment we could understand words. Mom would check our phones every single night before bed to make sure the ringers were off. Dad installed special software that automatically silenced all calls between midnight and 6 in the morning. My older sister Ivy and I never questioned it because questioning rules in the Graves household wasn't really an option. We just accepted it the same way we accepted that dinner was at 6 sharp and church was mandatory every Sunday. When I was 8 years old, I asked Mom why we had the phone rule. She was folding laundry in the living room and her hands froze mid-fold when the words left my mouth. She looked at me with this expression I'd never seen before, something between fear and anger, and said the rule existed to protect us from dangerous people who operate in darkness. She told me that nothing good ever came from phone calls after midnight, and that people who called during those hours had bad intentions. I remember nodding and never asking again, because her reaction scared me more than any explanation she could have given. Ivy was 22 when she broke the rule. I was 19 and home from college for winter break. It was a Thursday night in December, and I'd fallen asleep watching Netflix in my room around 11. I woke up to the sound of Ivy's voice coming from her bedroom next door. At first, I thought she was talking in her sleep, or maybe on a video call she'd started before midnight. But when I checked my phone, the screen showed 1:38 in the morning. My stomach dropped because I knew Ivy would never break the rule unless something was terribly wrong. I got up and pressed my ear against her door. Her voice sounded strange, flat, and emotionless, like she was reading from a script. I couldn't make out the words, but the tone made my skin crawl. I knocked softly and called her name, but she didn't respond. The talking continued in that same monotone voice for another 5 minutes before going silent. I tried the door handle and found it locked from the inside. I knocked harder and called her name louder until Mom and Dad appeared in the hallway looking panicked. Dad had a master key that unlocked all the bedroom doors in the house. He opened Ivy's door, and we found her sitting on her bed in the dark, phone in her lap, staring at the wall. The only light came from her phone screen, which was still active on a call that showed 1 hour and 17 minutes elapsed. Dad grabbed the phone and hung up immediately, but Ivy didn't react. She just kept staring at that same spot on the wall like she was in some kind of trance. Mom turned on the lights and started shaking Ivy's shoulders, calling her name over and over. It took almost 10 minutes before Ivy blinked and seemed to recognize where she was. When she finally snapped out of it, Ivy couldn't remember answering the phone. She said she'd been asleep and woke up sitting on her bed with us in her room. She had no memory of the call or what she'd said during those 77 minutes. Dad checked the call log on her phone, and his face went completely white. The incoming number was one we all recognized because it was written on a piece of paper taped inside every cabinet in our kitchen. It was the number we were supposed to call if there was ever an emergency. The number that belonged to someone named Lawrence Kane. I'd seen that number my entire life, but never questioned who Lawrence was or why we needed to be able to contact him. It was just another one of those family things that existed without explanation. But seeing Dad's reaction to that number appearing in Ivy's call log made something click in my mind. This wasn't about protecting us from random dangerous people. This was about protecting us from one specific person, and that person had just made contact with my sister in the middle of the night. Mom started crying and kept asking Ivy what she'd told him. Ivy insisted she didn't remember talking to anyone. Dad was on his own phone within seconds, making a call to someone and speaking in urgent, hushed tones. He used words like activated and protocol 3 and possible contamination. I stood there feeling like I'd woken up in a completely different family where nothing made sense anymore. Dad hung up and told us we had exactly 45 minutes to pack one bag each with essential items. We were leaving the house and wouldn't be coming back for a while. The next hour was chaos. Mom threw clothes into suitcases while Dad pulled boxes out of the attic that I'd never seen before. These boxes had labels like emergency documents and relocation kit. I packed my bag in a daze, still trying to process what was happening. Ivy moved like a robot, following Mom's instructions without speaking. Her eyes had this distant look like part of her was still somewhere else. At exactly 3:27 in the morning, 2 black SUVs pulled into our driveway. 4 people got out, all wearing dark suits and looking like they'd stepped out of a government thriller movie. A woman named Victoria Brennan introduced herself as our family's security coordinator. She spoke with military precision and immediately started directing everyone to specific vehicles. She separated Ivy from the rest of us, putting her in the second SUV with a man she called Dr. Sheffield. Victoria explained that Ivy needed to be evaluated to determine what information she might have shared during the phone call. They drove away first while we followed in the other vehicle. I tried to ask the driver where we were going, but he said everything would be explained at the secure location. We ended up at a facility that looked like a medical building from the outside, but felt more like a bunker once you got inside. The walls were concrete, there were no windows, and every door required a key card to open. They put us in separate rooms for questioning. A man named Officer Dalton spent 3 hours asking me questions about my family history, what I knew about Lawrence Kane, and whether I'd noticed any unusual behavior from Ivy in the weeks leading up to the phone call. I answered honestly that I knew almost nothing about any of this. When Dalton finally let me out, I found Mom and Dad in a conference room with Victoria and two other officials. Papers were spread across the table, and Mom was signing documents while Dad stared at his hands. Victoria saw me and gestured for me to sit down. She explained that our family had been in witness protection for the past 23 years. Our real last name wasn't Graves. Mom and Dad had testified against Lawrence Kane in a racketeering case when I was just a baby. Lawrence had been sentenced to life in prison, but he'd maintained his criminal organization from behind bars through a network of loyal associates. The midnight phone rule existed because Lawrence's organization had a specific protocol for making contact with protected witnesses. They would call between midnight and 6 in the morning using numbers that appeared to be from legitimate sources like banks or hospitals. If someone answered, they would use psychological manipulation techniques to extract information about current location, new identities, and daily routines. Victoria said these calls were extremely dangerous because the person being manipulated often had no memory of providing information. It was a form of conversational hypnosis that Lawrence's people had perfected over decades. Ivy had broken the rule by answering her phone, and now they needed to determine what she'd revealed. Dr. Sheffield was working with her using something called forensic hypnosis to recover the memories from that phone call. Victoria said the process could take days or even weeks. In the meantime, our entire family had to be relocated again because our current identities were potentially compromised. Everything we'd built over the past 2 decades, our home, our jobs, our friends, all of it had to be abandoned immediately. I felt my entire world crumbling as Victoria spoke. Every memory I had, every friendship I'd formed, every plan I'd made for my future, all of it was based on a lie. I wasn't who I thought I was. My parents weren't who I thought they were. And my sister had just destroyed the fragile safety we'd been living in without even knowing it. Dad tried to explain that they'd planned to tell Ivy and me the truth when we turned 25. They'd wanted to give us as much normal childhood as possible before burdening us with the reality of our situation. Mom kept apologizing through tears, saying they thought they'd done everything right to keep us safe. 3 days later, Dr. Sheffield finished his work with Ivy. He called us into a different conference room and played an audio recording of what Ivy had said during that phone call. Her voice on the recording was flat and robotic, answering questions with precise detail. She'd provided our home address, Dad's current employer, my college name and major, Mom's vehicle make and model, and a detailed description of our daily routines. She'd essentially given Lawrence's organization everything they needed to find us and monitor us. The person on the other end of the call had asked specific questions designed to extract maximum information in minimum time. Victoria explained that Lawrence's people now had a complete profile of our lives. They knew where we lived, where we worked, where we went to school, and what our patterns were. The organization was probably already positioning people to watch us and waiting for the right moment to act. She said Lawrence's typical approach was to conduct surveillance for several weeks to confirm the information before making a move. That meant we had maybe 2 or 3 weeks maximum before things escalated from watching to action. We needed to disappear completely before that window closed. The U.S. Marshals took over our case that same day. Agent Ramsey became our primary handler and started the process of creating new identities for all 4 of us. We spent a week in that bunker facility while they processed paperwork, created new documents, and made arrangements for our relocation. During that week, I learned things about my parents I'd never known. Their real names were David and Ellen Pritchard. Before witness protection, Dad had been Lawrence's accountant, and Mom had been his personal assistant. They'd turned against him when they discovered he was ordering hits on people who crossed him. Mom explained that she'd witnessed Lawrence giving the order to kill a prosecutor who was investigating his operations. She'd recorded the conversation on her phone and taken the evidence to the FBI. Dad had provided financial records that showed exactly how Lawrence was laundering money through legitimate businesses. Their testimony had been crucial in securing Lawrence's conviction, but it had also made them permanent targets. Lawrence had connections in prison, connections in law enforcement, connections everywhere. That's why witness protection had been necessary, and why breaking the midnight phone rule had been so catastrophic. I asked Ramsey why Lawrence was so obsessed with finding us after all these years. He said it wasn't just about revenge, though that was certainly part of it. Lawrence's organization still operated, run by his son and several trusted lieutenants. Finding and eliminating witnesses from the original case sent a message to current and potential future informants that Lawrence's reach was eternal. It was about maintaining fear and control. Mom and Dad weren't the only former associates who'd testified. There had been 7 witnesses total, and 3 of them had died under mysterious circumstances in the past decade, despite being in witness protection. The realization that we'd been living with this threat hovering over us for my entire life made me feel sick. Every birthday party, every school play, every normal moment of my childhood had existed against a backdrop of danger I'd never known about. Dad tried to explain that they'd wanted to protect our innocence for as long as possible. He said knowing about Lawrence would have stolen our ability to be kids. I understood their logic, but I couldn't shake the feeling of betrayal. They'd made the decision to keep us in the dark, and now Ivy and I were paying the price for their secrets. 2 weeks after the phone call, we were relocated to a city I can't name in a state I can't mention. Our new identities were more carefully constructed this time. Ramsey said they'd learned from mistakes in the previous placement. Our new last name was Thornhill. Dad became Gordon Thornhill, Mom became Susan, I became Alex, and Ivy became Nicole. We had completely fabricated histories with school records, employment records, and even social media accounts that had been carefully backdated to look authentic. The Marshalls rented us a house in a quiet neighborhood and set us up with new phones that had monitoring software installed. Ivy struggled the most with the transition. She'd been in her final year of college when everything fell apart. She'd had a serious boyfriend, close friends, and a job lined up after graduation. All of that vanished overnight. She couldn't contact anyone from her old life, couldn't explain where she'd gone, couldn't even say goodbye. She sank into a depression that scared all of us. Dr. Sheffield recommended therapy, but finding a therapist who understood the unique circumstances of witness protection was complicated. The Marshal Service eventually connected her with Dr. Amanda Yates, who specialized in trauma and had security clearance to work with protected witnesses. I enrolled in a new college under my new name and tried to build a life that felt somewhat normal, but I couldn't make real friends because I couldn't tell them the truth about who I was. Every conversation felt like a performance where I had to remember my lines perfectly. One slip, one inconsistent detail, and the whole facade could crumble. I started keeping a notebook where I wrote down everything about my fake identity so I wouldn't forget important details. It felt insane to need a cheat sheet to remember my own supposed childhood, but that was the reality of living a manufactured life. Mom got a job as an administrative assistant at a medical office. Dad found work as a bookkeeper for a small construction company. They were both overqualified for these positions, but they couldn't use their real credentials or work history. Starting over in your mid-40s with a completely blank resume was brutal. I watched them struggle with the loss of everything they'd worked for. Dad had been a successful accountant with his own clients. Mom had been on track for an executive position before everything collapsed. Now they were entry-level employees making barely enough to pay bills. 6 months into our new lives, Ramsey showed up at our house with 2 other agents. They'd intercepted communications indicating that Lawrence's organization had tracked us to our general region. They didn't have our exact location yet, but they were narrowing the search. Ramsey recommended we relocate again immediately. Dad exploded at this news. He stood up and started yelling about how we couldn't keep running forever. He said we'd already lost everything once, and he wasn't willing to do it again. Mom tried to calm him down, but he was beyond reasoning. Ramsey explained that the organization had sophisticated methods for finding people. They used data brokers, hacked databases, and had informants in places that should have been secure. He said one slip on social media, one security camera capture, one facial recognition match, and they'd have us. The threat was real and immediate. Dad demanded to know what the alternative was. Ramsey said there wasn't one. We either relocated or we took our chances staying put with enhanced security measures. Dad chose to stay, and the rest of us followed his decision because we were exhausted from running. The enhanced security measures included cameras around our house, panic buttons in every room, and a direct line to local police who'd been briefed on our situation. Ramsey assigned an agent named Douglas Craig to conduct periodic drive-bys and check-ins. Craig would park on our street for hours at a time, watching for any suspicious activity. I got used to seeing his gray sedan with the tinted windows sitting 3 houses down. It became a strange kind of comfort knowing he was there, even though his presence was a constant reminder of the danger we lived in. Ivy started making progress in therapy with Dr. Yates. She was learning to process the guilt she felt about answering that phone call. Dr. Yates helped her understand that she'd been targeted with sophisticated psychological manipulation and that blaming herself wasn't productive, but knowing something intellectually and feeling it emotionally were 2 different things. Ivy carried the weight of what she'd done like physical chains. She barely ate, barely slept, and I'd often find her staring at nothing with tears running down her face. I tried to be supportive, but I was dealing with my own anger about the situation. Part of me blamed Ivy for destroying our lives even though I knew it wasn't rational. She hadn't intentionally answered the phone. She'd been asleep and somehow got manipulated into picking up without being fully conscious. But logic didn't erase the fact that my entire existence had been upended because of her actions. I struggled with resenting her while simultaneously feeling guilty for that resentment. Our relationship became strained and awkward. We barely spoke beyond necessary exchanges. 8 months after the relocation, Agent Craig spotted a man conducting surveillance on our house. The man was sitting in a coffee shop across the street with a laptop, but Craig noticed he was taking photos of our home. Craig approached and questioned him. The man claimed he was a real estate photographer working on listings for the neighborhood. He had business cards and a website that looked legitimate, but Craig's instincts told him something was off. He took the man's information and ran a background check that came back clean. Still, Craig reported the incident to Ramsey. Ramsey increased our security level and assigned a second agent for overnight surveillance. He also recommended we vary our routines and be hypervigilant about our surroundings. The paranoia that had started to fade came rushing back. Every car that drove past our house too slowly became a potential threat. Every person who looked at us twice became suspicious. We were living in a constant state of anxiety that was slowly destroying us. Mom started having panic attacks. Dad developed insomnia. Ivy's depression worsened, and I felt myself becoming a shell of who I used to be. 3 weeks after the surveillance incident, Ramsey came to our house with news that changed everything. They'd arrested someone in connection with Lawrence's organization, a mid-level operator named Vincent Ortega, who'd been running the witness location program. During interrogation, Vincent had revealed that Lawrence was dying. He had terminal cancer and was expected to live maybe another 6 months. Lawrence had made finding and eliminating Mom and Dad his final mission. He was pouring all remaining resources into locating us because he wanted revenge before he died. This information was both terrifying and oddly hopeful. If Lawrence died, his son might not maintain the same level of commitment to hunting us down. The organization would likely shift focus to protecting their current operations rather than pursuing old vengeance. Ramsey said we just needed to survive long enough for Lawrence to die, and then our threat level would decrease significantly. It wasn't a guarantee of safety, but it was better odds than we'd had before. The question was whether we could outlast him. Vincent also provided information about how the organization had been tracking us. They'd been monitoring database breaches and using stolen information to cross-reference potential identities. They'd found us through a combination of Mom's medical records from a specialist appointment and facial recognition software that flagged her at a grocery store. The technology available to criminal organizations was becoming indistinguishable from what law enforcement had access to. Ramsey said this was a growing problem in witness protection. The old methods of simply changing names and moving to new cities weren't sufficient anymore. Based on Vincent's information, Ramsey recommended we make another move, but this time with different protocols. He wanted us to go to a smaller, more isolated location, where surveillance would be easier and facial recognition less likely. He suggested a rural area where we'd stand out less because everyone stood out. Small towns had their own security benefits. Everyone noticed strangers, which made it harder for outside operatives to blend in. Mom and Dad agreed to the move, and within a week, we were packing up again. Our third identity became the Mercer family. We moved to a town of 8,000 people in a state that felt like a different country from where we'd been. Everything was slower, quieter, and more isolated. Dad got a job at a local feed store. Mom found work at the town library. Ivy and I both enrolled in online college programs, so we wouldn't have to attend physical campuses where facial recognition could spot us. Our house was a small ranch at the end of a dirt road with the nearest neighbor half a mile away. It was lonely and depressing, but it was also as safe as we could reasonably be. Agent Craig remained our primary security contact, now conducting check-ins remotely and making monthly visits in person. Ramsey called weekly with updates on Lawrence's condition. The cancer was progressing faster than doctors had predicted. Lawrence was now in hospice care and wasn't expected to last more than a few weeks. Each call from Ramsey brought news that Lawrence was weaker, more incapacitated, closer to the end. We lived in this strange limbo, waiting for a man we'd never met to die so we could stop running from his shadow. Lawrence Kane died on a Monday morning in April. Ramsey called us with the news, and I could hear the relief in his voice. He said the organization was already fragmenting without Lawrence's leadership. His son was facing a power struggle with the other lieutenants, and they were too busy fighting among themselves to worry about old witnesses. Ramsey said we should maintain our current identities and location for at least another year to be safe, but the immediate threat had significantly decreased. For the first time in over a year, I felt like I could breathe. Ivy's recovery accelerated after Lawrence's death. Knowing that the immediate danger had passed lifted some of the crushing guilt she'd been carrying. She started painting again, something she'd loved before, but had abandoned during our nightmare. Her sessions with Dr. Yates became less frequent as she learned to forgive herself. She even started dating someone local, a guy named Kevin, who worked at the hardware store. Watching her smile genuinely for the first time in months made me realize how much we'd all lost and how far we still had to go to heal. 2 years after Lawrence's death, Ramsey gave us permission to reclaim our real identities if we wanted to. The organization had collapsed completely, and the remaining members were either in prison or had moved on to other criminal enterprises. We were no longer considered high-priority targets. Mom and Dad decided to keep living as Gordon and Susan Thornhill. They said they'd been David and Ellen Pritchard for such a short part of their lives compared to how long they'd been in protection. The Thornhill identity felt more real to them now. Ivy chose to go back to being Ivy Pritchard, her real name, because she needed that connection to who she'd been before everything fell apart. I decided to stay as Alex Mercer because I'd never really known who the baby version of me had been before witness protection. Alex Mercer was the only identity that felt authentic to me. We still live in that small rural town, and we still follow the midnight phone rule out of habit, even though the reason for it no longer exists. Some fears are too deeply ingrained to simply disappear when the threat does. We've built a quiet life here that feels almost normal. Mom runs the library now. Dad manages the feed store. Ivy teaches art at the local community center and married Kevin last fall. I graduated college online and work as a remote software developer. We have friends, routines, and a sense of stability we never had before. But there's a permanent wariness in all of us. A hyper-awareness of our surroundings that will probably never fully fade. We survived, but the experience fundamentally changed who we are. Every phone call after midnight still makes my heart race, even though I know rationally that the danger has passed. Some rules transcend their original purpose and become part of who you are. And for the Thornhill family, the midnight phone rule will always be sacred.